You may have heard that there is a connection between math and music. You may even know someone who seems to have a natural ability in both areas. You may even be one of those people. My name is Raffi Kasparian, and for over 20 years, I have maintained a dual career as a performing musician and software engineer. My interest in mathematics started from as early as I can remember in my childhood. My passion for music coming several years later when I was 13 years old. While connections can be made between music and math, I don't find them quite as compelling as connections between the mathematical mind and the musical mind, especially when considering classical music. For myself, I believe this connection stems from the fact that both fields can be understood from the viewpoint of an engineer. In the course of the next hour, I will bring you on my personal journey of discovery in the area of mathematical polyhedra. A journey born purely out of a desire to have fun and explore within the realm of mathematics. Then I will bring us deep into the musical realm, the intricacies of a musical composition and the mind of its composer. I will then perform the piece. Both realms, mathematical and musical, will be discussed from an engineering viewpoint because they both are examples of engineering, one yielding discoveries in the area of mathematical solids, and the other yielding a passionate and, if I do say so myself, beautiful musical composition. First, the math. The year was 1997, and my wife was visiting her family in the Philippines, leaving me alone at home for a month. As I often would do, I went to our local bookstore and browsed their math, science, computer bookshelves to see if there was any entertaining reading I might pick up. I found this book, Shapes, Space, and Symmetry by Alan Holden. This book looked like a lot of fun, and it served as my first formal introduction to this area of mathematics. As you can see from some of the pages in the book, the author has built models of various mathematically defined solids that are called polyhedra. He also analyzes their construction and relationships. I found the book fascinating. Time for a definition. A polyhedron is a three-dimensional shape with flat polygonal faces, straight edges, and sharp corners or vertices, and it is called a polyhedron, originating from the two Greek words poly and hedron. Here, poly means many, and hedron means surface. For example, a cube, prism, or pyramid are polyhedrons. The plural of polyhedron is polyhedra. I was intrigued by the models that the author, Holden, discusses, and I wished I had a polyhedral construction set of my own. I imagine maybe a bunch of plastic, multicolored polygons that could somehow connect together edge to edge to build polyhedra. Playing with Legos was one of my favorite pastimes as a child, and then it became a favorite pastime again when my boy was a child. Playing with polygons would be like a more grown-up form of Legos. So if anyone questioned my pursuit, I could always say, "Hey, it's math." I made a few paper models just for today's presentation to give you an idea what this process might look like. Here, I have 3 squares connected edge to edge. If I were to bring these last 2 squares together, you see that they would make a 3-dimensional shape, which could be the basis of a cube if we continued building corners like that. Next, we have a triangle, a square, and a pentagon. And these two, if I brought the triangle and pentagon together, would create a three-dimensional corner of some three-dimensional object. But I'm a software engineer. I was writing software as a hobbyist ever since Apple released their Macintosh SE computer in the late 80s and early 90s. I'm not a paper or plastic engineer. And I thought, why spend a weekend cutting out paper polygons and assembling them with Scotch tape and glue when I could spend weeks, even months, developing software to do it virtually? I'd get to spend time developing software, which I love, and I'd get to play with virtual polyhedra forever without worrying about paper or glue wearing out. We will be using my software creation, which I named Archimedean, for the portion of today's presentation dealing with polyhedra. Perhaps the standard approach to building a software tool for displaying the Platonic and Archimedean solids would be to obtain a list of all the possible solids, calculate their geometric coordinates and where all their faces lie, and then have the computer construct them accordingly. Much like assembling a piece of furniture from a kit, just follow the instructions. This would be a very reasonable approach. But it's not the approach I took, because my goal was not to merely assemble solids from instructions. I wanted to play with polygons and see what solids might be constructed, to make mistakes and discover why they were mistakes. Just as if I were sitting on the carpet in my home, polygon cutouts spread out in front of me, exploring in my hands the many ways I might connect them. I fully expected that my software would be able to build all the solids, at least the ones that I saw in the book, but it would be building them experimentally, without pre-knowledge of what could be constructed and without assembly instructions. I named the first version of this software tool Archimedean 1.0, written completely in the new, at the time, and powerful Java language. We will now use Archimedean 1.0 to illustrate this exploratory building process. Let's say that we'd like to build a cube. Well, we know that at every corner of a cube there are 3 squares. So we begin by choosing 3 squares, and then telling Archimedean to create that first corner. So here we have it, the first corner of what we believe is going to be a cube. And now we continue adding squares to incomplete corners until there are no incomplete corners left. All right, look, only 1 square is required to fill this hole. And there we have it. We have completed, with the aid of Archimedean, a cube. Now let's say we want to try something a little bit more exotic than a cube. How about a square, a hexagon, and an octagon? We can certainly make a corner this way. Let's create it. All right, there we go. Now let's see what kind of a solid this can create. So right here you'll see that we need a hexagon. We have to always complete the corners so that every corner has a square, hexagon, and octagon. So that is all I will be doing. Hexagon here, square here, hexagon here, oops, square here, octagon, square, octagon, square. What do we have so far? Well, we're about halfway done. Let's continue. Octagon here, hexagon here, oops, go. Square. Square. Hexagon. Oops, didn't make it. There we go. Square. Octagon. Hexagon. Square. Octagon. Square. We're nearly done, I think. Yes, there's only room for 2 more polygons. We need a square here. Oops. And what do you think? Looks like a hexagon will completely fill this hole. Now, it's important to note that corners must join at the back side of a polyhedron. If they don't, the polyhedron has not been built. So, let's put in our last piece. Does it fit? Yes, it does. We have completed a polyhedron with the square, hexagon, and octagon at every corner. Often, as was the case for this, for a given combination of polygons at a corner, there is only one way to build the polyhedron, given that each corner has to have the same combination of polygons. And in these cases, it is obvious which polygons are needed where, and completing the polyhedron is simply a matter of completing incomplete corners in the only possible way. This is not always the case, however. Sometimes, with more complex polygon combinations, there are several plausible paths one might choose in completing a corner, and it is only after choosing a path and moving forward, continuing to complete corners as they arise, that one can be sure whether the correct choice was made. If bad things start to happen, then the path we chose was not the right one, and we need to try another path. According to the logic I built into Archimedean, a polyhedron is successfully completed if 1. All corners have been created, 2. All corners are identical, and 3. There are no holes. There is naturally a ton of mathematics and engineering required to compute coordinates and display objects in 3-dimensional perspective on a computer screen. There is no way around that. The human eye easily notices aberrations and departures from recognizable patterns, so the mathematics and engineering of the polyhedra had to be very precise. In mathematics especially, there is no such thing as almost is good enough. Polygonal faces that come close to joining but not quite do not create polyhedra. Cubes without parallel edges, for example, are not cubes. Unlike engineering and music, which we will discuss later, mathematical engineering is either right or wrong, and there are infinitely many more ways to be wrong than they are to be right. I have just shown you an example of a Platonic solid and an Archimedean solid without actually defining what those are. I guess it's time for some more definitions. Discovered around the year 400 BC by the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, a Platonic solid is any of the 5 geometric solids whose faces are all identical, regular polygons, meeting at the same 3-dimensional angles. As it turns out, there are only 5 Platonic solids that can be created. Here they are: the tetrahedron, made from 3 triangles at every corner; the cube, also known as the hexahedron, made from 3 squares at every corner; the octahedron, made from 4 triangles at every corner; the dodecahedron, made from 3 pentagons at every corner; and the icosahedron, made from 5 triangles at every corner. Actually, it's kind of amazing to me that these polyhedra can be built at all. I see no intuitive reason why 2-dimensional polygons should be able to assemble such regular 3-dimensional surfaces, but they do. Here's another definition. Discovered about 150 years later, around the year 250 BC, by the ancient Greek mathematician Archimedes, an Archimedean solid is any one of the 13 geometric solids whose corners are all identical, made from combining 2 or more types of regular polygons at the same 3-dimensional angles. Here they are. The truncated tetrahedron, with a triangle and 2 hexagons at every corner. The truncated cube, with a triangle and 2 octagons at every corner. The truncated octahedron, with a square and 2 hexagons at every corner. The cuboctahedron, with a triangle, square, triangle, square at every corner. The small rhombi cuboctahedron, with a triangle and 3 squares at every corner. The great rhombi cuboctahedron, with a square, hexagon, and octagon at every corner. The snub cube, with 4 triangles and a square at every corner. The truncated dodecahedron, with a triangle and 2 decagons at every corner. The truncated icosahedron, with a pentagon and 2 hexagons at every corner. The icosahedodecahedron, with a triangle, pentagon, triangle, pentagon at every corner. The small rhombicosahedodecahedron, with a triangle, square, pentagon, square at every corner. The great rhombicosahedodecahedron, with a square, hexagon, and decagon at every corner. And finally, the snub dodecahedron, with 4 triangles and a pentagon at every corner. Again, it's kind of amazing that these polyhedra can be built at all. But not all combinations of polygons will succeed in creating a polyhedron. Let's see what happens when we try to build a polyhedron where every corner has 2 triangles, a pentagon, and a hexagon. Create. Uh-oh. Obviously, Archimedean failed at producing a polyhedron for this combination of polygons. It even says so right here, although it might be hard for you to read, but it says unable to complete the solid. Well, no kidding. Really, it looks more like a papier-mâché bathing cap than a polyhedron. Looking at what Archimedes came up with, you may wonder why it had to assemble so many polygons before deciding it wouldn't work. I think any one of us could have determined that it was headed for failure very much earlier in the process. Let's just watch Archimedes try to build this polyhedron from scratch to see where it went off the rails. All right, here we go. It's building its first corner. 2 triangles, pentagon, hexagon. So far, so good. Starts adding more sides. So far, so good. Uh-oh. Already something strange has happened. There was no room for the hexagon. It's overlapping the pentagon. Will Archimedes figure out what happened? No, it seems like it's not. It continues to add more polygons. What is it doing? Well, all right. We've seen enough of that. It looks like it might have continued building forever if it hadn't finally stopped on its own. Let's try another combination of polygons. How about a triangle, a hexagon, and an octagon? Create. Well, this looks a little bit better, but something is still very wrong. Let's look at this creation from another mode. Instead of filling in all the polygons, we can just draw the edges so we can see through them, as it were. Wow, that's a lot of polygons. Really, it looks more like a ball of yarn than a polyhedron. Fortunately, Archimedean does detect certain conditions in the building process when they arise that mean a polyhedron is not able to be completed. That's because I programmed what is known as exit conditions into its logic. If I hadn't, Archimedean would have continued adding sides forever in an infinite loop until it crashed or the computer ran out of memory. At one time during code development and testing, I had disabled the exit conditions and then forgotten that I had disabled them. To my surprise, I discovered that Archimedean actually completed some polyhedra that were not cataloged anywhere on the internet. Polyhedra that it would not have completed if I had left my exit conditions in place. Unexpectedly, somehow, if I let it continue assembling corners beyond the point that I had determined meant failure, Archimedean's building process would reach a natural conclusion by determining that 1, all corners had been created, and 2, all corners were identical, and 3, there were no holes. This was shocking, to say the least, and it was also frustrating that Archimedean didn't seem to know how to display them, even though it said they had been built. Let's take a look at a couple of these surprise polyhedra. The first one that I stumbled across was made from a triangle, square, and pentagon at every corner. When I tell Archimedean to create that solid, it gives me this. Now, something looks wrong with this, but if we draw the edges only so we can look through the polygons, you can see that there is definitely an order here and a symmetry. It looks like this might be something, but what? And then the next one that I stumbled across was made from a square, pentagon, and hexagon at each corner. Create. Well, again, something is definitely wrong with it, but if we look at just the edges, it seems like this is meaningful. Again, there's order and symmetry. So, even though I didn't understand what I had stumbled across, I had a feeling it was important. It took a while, but I finally realized that with these solids, polygons were not just meeting each other edge to edge. They were slicing right through each other on their way to finding edges to meet. That is something I would not have been able to replicate with paper or plastic polygons. Only in computer 3D rendering, which is unconcerned with the physical realities of the physical universe. I had written my own 3D rendering system from scratch, based on the assumption that I would only ever be dealing with Platonic and Archimedean solids. This allowed my code to take very many simplifying shortcuts and achieve excellent visual results. But it obviously was inadequate for these new creations. Polygons slicing through each other, cutting each other into little bits, and hiding little bits of each other was beyond Archimedean 1.0's ability to display. And without a better rendering system, I wasn't going to be able to understand just what I had discovered. Time passed without my saying a word to anybody, just pondering the implications of what it seemed that I had discovered. Could it be that in the world of polyhedral discoveries, after Plato and Archimedes, I, Kasparian, would join their long line of successors, including giants such as Johannes Kepler? Surely not. The idea was too heady to even contemplate. Not being able to render them, though, was preventing me from understanding them, and not understanding them was holding me back from sharing my discoveries with the world. After all, I wouldn't want to tell anyone about what I had discovered until I myself knew what I had discovered, if it was of any worth and I could explain it. Approximately 15 years passed, and development on Archimedean ground to a halt while I gathered the courage to tackle the significantly more sophisticated rendering logic that I would need to develop. But I would still use Archimedean to demonstrate polyhedral construction and to impress my friends. In the meantime, Archimedean was available on the internet for anyone in the world to play with. And it did become noticed. To this day, it is being used at schools and universities around the world for teaching three-dimensional geometry. While we are waiting 15 years for me to figure this all out, let's take time out for me to explain how I came to have my musical and mathematical interests and vocations in the first place. My father was an engineer, and my mother was a stage actress. From my youngest years, I always had a love for mathematics, puzzles, and engineering. I also had a love and natural talent for theater and performance. I remember as a child happily spending hours alone drawing elaborate mazes or labyrinths, and at other times playing with mathematics and logical conundrums with my father. When I was 6 years old, I was given an accordion as my first musical instrument and showed a high degree of talent. But like most children my age, I had very little interest in practicing. After a year, my mother said that we would discontinue lessons if I wouldn't practice. I'm not sure what she expected my response would be, but I was quite happy to discontinue lessons if it meant that there would be no pressure to practice. And it was right there that my musical life might have died a youthful and uninspired death. In the meantime, my love of math persisted. I was certain that I would be a mathematician or some sort of scientist when I grew up. But one magical day, when I was 13 years old, I found on my bedroom shelf a vinyl 33 RPM recording that my parents had given me I don't know how many years earlier. Until then, I had completely neglected it, so out of curiosity, I placed it on my record player and listened. It was a compilation of 6 famous piano concertos. I was enthralled by the beauty and power of the music, so much so that I brought my long-forgotten accordion out of the closet and began practicing it again, eager to learn how to replicate the beauty of the music I had just heard. A few months later, my mother convinced me to take piano lessons, and almost immediately I began to dream of becoming a concert pianist. Many years of education and diligent practice later, I became the pianist for the United States Army Band, from which I retired in the year 2015, after 25 years of performing with them. What happened to math? Well, while in the Army Band, I picked up computer programming as a hobby, learned the Java language, and in time developed the Archimedean program, just for fun. The company, SAIC, that's Science Applications International Corporation, was so impressed with what I had created that they offered me a part-time job as a software engineer, a second and simultaneous career that I maintained through the bulk of my Army career until I retired from it in the year 2023. And there you have it, two vocations born of two passions, passions into which I gladly and without coercion poured hours of time, love, and work to explore and polish. Okay, the year is now 2015, and I took on the challenge of transforming Archimedean 1.0 into Archimedean 2.0, capable of rendering solids with intersecting sides and much more. Let's look at the finished product and see what these Kasparian solids look like. Please enjoy the construction of the Kasparian 345, followed by the construction of the Kasparian 456, while we listen in the background to my composition for solo piano, Pasacaglia. In the year 2016, I finally shared my secret with my friend and Marymount mathematics professor, Dr. Alice Patillo, who was already using Archimedean in her geometry classes. I knew that I could trust her with my secret, and that if I ever was going to introduce my discoveries to the world, she could show me how to do it. She did research and found some publications by a mathematician in England who, it seemed, had discovered something similar to my discoveries. She asked me to look over his materials and see if he and I were talking about the same thing. Well, his approach to polyhedra was very mathematical and, frankly, above my head, but it did seem that he and I were talking about essentially the same solids. He was interpreting them differently than I was, and had derived them differently than I had through my accidental discovery. It is very interesting to me that we both made our discoveries at very nearly the same time. In the year 2018, Patrick Taylor published his book on what he calls compound polytopes, in which one chapter, titled Ditrigonal Vertex Figures, discusses his and my polyhedra. By my count, there are 30 distinct Kasparian constructions. I would like to show you 3 more that you haven't yet seen, just to give you an idea of the variety that exists. We can make one, for instance, from a square, a pentagon, and a decagon at each corner. Here's the corner, and here's the completed construction. Or we can make one from a triangle, a square, and a decagon. Here is its corner. And here is the completed construction. And last, for today, we can make one from an 8-pointed star, a triangle, and a square. The corner looks like this, and the completed construction like this. If you would like to explore polyhedra more using Archimedean 2.0, you may certainly do that using the following URL. In the year 2017, in collaboration with Dr. Alice Patillo, I presented to the annual International Bridges Conference on Mathematical Connections in Art, Music, Architecture, and Culture my paper, Introducing the Kasparian Constructions. And so ends this half of today's presentation, from its humble beginnings to its potentially earth-shattering discovery, to its humble presentation on the world mathematical stage. While I have focused on my story of discovery, I hope the engineering aspect of the process was not lost on you. Precise rules govern the building of polyhedra and the software to do it virtually. Software engineers and mathematicians operate within strict systems of rules. Now we will see how systems of rules also apply to classical musical composition. There is a connection via engineering between mathematics and music composition. Just as one could look at a polyhedron and say, "Nice shape," without understanding the first thing about its structure, one can listen to a piece of music and say, "That's pretty," without understanding the first thing about its structure. In both cases, understanding the structure is key to appreciating the finished product more fully. We will be approaching my composition, Serenade Fantasy, similarly to how we approached polyhedra. We squashed the 3 dimensions of polyhedra into 2 spatial dimensions so that we could more easily analyze them on a screen. For my music, we will squash its logical construction into 2 spatial dimensions representing time and sound. Here is a diagram showing the high-level structure of Serenade Fantasy, my own original composition from almost 40 years ago. This diagram gives us a visual overview of its structure because we have replaced time with a spatial dimension, horizontal axis, and sound with multicolored rectangles. The diagram is a series of blocks moving left to right along the time axis. Each block represents a certain interval of time within the music, its width and placement roughly proportional to the length of time it represents and the moment at which it occurs within the music, which totals about 12 minutes. Each block is color-coded and labeled according to the actual high-level musical elements it represents. First off, let's notice that the piece is composed of 2 halves of similar duration and similar construction. First half, second half. Each half is composed of sections called Theme 1, or Main, Theme 2, or Waltz, a development section, and Theme 3, or Lyrical. Same thing for the second half. Theme 1, Main, Theme 2, Waltz, a development section, and Theme 3, Lyrical. Notice that the biggest difference between both halves lies in the development sections. As you can see by the colors and labels, the first half development incorporates Theme 1, Main, and Theme 2, Waltz, along with a thin block in between them that we haven't discussed yet, while the second half development is represented simply as a gray block. This is because, in it, themes are so varied, disassembled, and reassembled, in short, developed, that it was nearly impossible to represent it with a multicolored block. Don't worry, we'll be looking at this second development in great detail, because it is in some way the most important and intriguing section of the piece. But first, we'll need to experience the undeveloped musical elements in order to appreciate what happens to them later. Let's listen. First theme, named Main, color-coded green, first half. Second half. Second theme, named Waltz, color-coded blue, first half. Second half. We'll skip the developments for now and go on to the third theme, lyrical, color-coded salmon, not red, first half. second half. There is also interstitial tissue between those blocks, not substantial enough to be called themes, but certainly substantial enough to be called motifs. They too play an important part in the overall design of the piece. At risk of straining the analogy between polyhedra and serenade fantasy, the themes, main, waltz, and lyrical, and also the development section, are like polygonal faces, while the motives are like the edges where they join. Here is the opening motive with which the piece begins. It is characterized by a slowly repeated note followed by several melodic notes in relative quick succession. It is heard a second time in between the second theme and development sections in the first half. It is heard within the development section of the first half, but at twice the speed, so it may not be so obviously the same to your ear. Then in the second half, it opens. The last time it occurs is just before the end, and this last time it's actually missing the final melodic notes. Listen to it. I call the other motif fragment because it is the initial fragment of the lyrical theme. It is color-coded red. Look at the opening four notes. Now look at the opening four notes of the lyrical theme. Do you notice they're the same? This is why it's called a fragment. Here is the fragment in the first half, separating themes 1 and theme 2. As is usual with this piece, you'll hear the fragment 3 times in a row. Here it is again, connecting in the first half the development with the third theme. Here it is in the second half, connecting theme 1 and theme 2. Again in the second half, connecting the development with theme 3. And you will hear it at the very end of the piece, slightly different because it doesn't end with the leap up to a high note. From a dramatic standpoint, since the fragment is heard several times before the lyrical theme is ever introduced, let's look at that. The lyrical theme is first introduced here at the end of the first half. And you'll see that fragment occurs here and here. So that by the time the lyrical theme is presented in its full form, we have an instant and comforting feeling of recognition. My use of fragment for this purpose was quite intentional. So let's review. First theme, main. Second theme, waltz. Third theme, lyrical. The opening motive, which is characterized by a repeated note. And fragment, which is characterized by the opening notes of lyrical. Now let's look at the development section in the first half. It begins with waltz. Melodically, the waltz theme descends first stepwise and then by skips. Let's listen to it in its original form first. And now let's listen to it in the development section. But be warned, it is twice as fast here, and you may need to hear it a couple times before you realize that it really is still the waltz theme, and that was why I pointed out the stepwise descent followed by leaps in descent. Let's listen to that again. Listen for the steps down and the skips down. Next is the opening motive, also twice as fast. I hope you keyed into the repeated notes at the beginning for that. Then the last part of the development is the main theme, and it is actually easier to identify because it's at its normal speed. You may notice, however, that it is accompanied by some of the waltz theme patterns as well as by additional contrapuntal lines. Okay, now for the development in the second half. Fasten your seatbelts. Unlike for the other blocks, which revealed a simplified musical notation of the actual music being represented, I found it necessary to show the full score for this development section. I added color-coded highlighting to help us see how the various elements with which we are now familiar have been utilized. Let's take a quick stroll through the music of this section. So first of all, this is the entire development section, and I'm scrolling from the left all the way to the far right, and you see the various colors that are associated with the themes and motifs that I've already introduced to you. All right, so starting at the beginning of the development, we have the lyrical theme. It's really a fragment of it. It's the three rising notes followed by a leap up. Listen to that. Let's listen to it again. They're not the highest notes. They're the notes in the middle register of the piano. Okay, and then the next red blob is actually a technique that composers often use in development sections. I have inverted the lyrical theme, so now instead of the three notes rising, I have three notes descending. Again. Put them together from the lyrical fragment in its original orientation and then inverted, you get this. And then again, the same thing happens here. Okay, then we move forward, and you notice we start using other materials. The yellowish blob represents the opening motive. Remember, that has the repeated notes. And the blue blobs are taking advantage of the characteristic of the waltz, which is descending pairs of notes. So first, listen to the opening theme. It's the highest note repeated. It's ba-da-da-da. Listen again, pardon my singing. Okay, that's the opening theme. And underneath it, we have the waltz theme, just fragments of it. Listen. Ba-dum. Again. And then over here, another one. La-dum. So the first one. Ba-dum. Second one. Ba-dum. All right, put them together, the repeated notes of the opening motive with the fragments of waltz. And then that happens again over here. And it again happens here. Next, we shift to focusing on the main theme, green. You can hear it here. And again here. But now notice here, before it gets to the end of the green blob, red, which represents the lyrical theme, joins. And the red starts from below and crosses through to become the higher notes, at which point red continues in the higher notes. This causes actually the lyrical theme to be the most prominent, but you'll be able to hear that both are happening at the same time. So starting here. Then we have a new kind of technique for development. I have taken fragments of various themes and joined them together to make longer melodic lines. So here we have the characteristic descending pairs of notes from the waltz. And in the green blob here, we have the main theme, just a couple measures from it. Put them together and you have a new melody. And it happens again here. And again here. Well, that's probably enough focusing. Oh, I should talk about this. So the development then focuses on lyrical and the waltz theme. You can see they're joined together, they're fragmented, they occur simultaneously, and then it ends by focusing on the lyrical fragment until the end of the development, which ushers in the final statement of the lyrical theme. Okay, I think that's enough dissecting of the development section to give you an idea how it is assembled. I hope the aspect of engineering behind Serenade Fantasy has not been lost on you. In the world of classical music, Serenade Fantasy is not unique in this regard. Almost all classical music is engineered, and some much more highly engineered than my composition. In music, rules are more lenient than in mathematics. For example, there is no right and wrong. An aberration or departure from recognizable patterns may be considered valid artistic expression. Nevertheless, as with all engineering, the composer of a classical musical composition operates within a system of rules. A system that, in conjunction with the composer's heart and imagination, makes possible the inner structure and consistency so necessary for a piece of classical music to communicate. I will now perform Serenade Fantasy, my original composition from almost 40 years ago that I had completely forgotten and only recently rediscovered earlier this year in my musical archives.